There is a port in the desert of Arabia that has been quietly bleeding for 2 years. Not from war, not from disaster, but from something far more calculated. From a neighbor, a supposed ally, a brother nation that decided the fastest way to build its own empire was to quietly dismantle yours. This is not a story about ships. This is a story about power, geography, and a war that most of the world does not even know is being fought. And once you understand what is happening between Saudi Arabia and the UAE right now, you will never look at a shipping container the same way again. The New Silk Road. People hear that phrase and they think of China. They think of belts and roads and infrastructure deals in Africa. But the real action, the most dangerous, most consequential piece of the New Silk Road puzzle, is not in Beijing. It is not even in Africa. It is in a strip of coastline between two Gulf nations that have been smiling at each other in public, while quietly going for each other's throats behind closed doors. Here's the thing you need to understand first. The world does not run on oil anymore. It runs on logistics. It runs on who controls the ports, the routes, the transshipment hubs, the choke points where cargo from Asia flows toward Europe and Africa. And for decades, one country owned that position almost completely, the UAE, specifically a port called Jebel Ali. And everything was flowing through it. Jebel Ali is not just a port. It is the economic heartbeat of the modern Middle East. In 2023, it handled 15.7 million shipping containers, 15.7 million TEUs, making it one of the top 10 busiest ports on the entire planet. It is the reason Dubai became Dubai. It is the reason the UAE became the re-export capital of the world. If you shipped something from China to the Middle East, or from India to East Africa, or from anywhere to anywhere in this part of the world, there was a very good chance it touched Jebel Ali soil. That port was not just infrastructure. It was leverage. It was control. It was the engine of Emirati economic dominance for 30 years. And Saudi Arabia watched all of this. For 30 years, Saudi Arabia watched its smaller neighbor, a country with a fraction of its land, a fraction of its population, a fraction of its historical weight, become the logistics capital of an entire region. Saudi goods were being routed through Emirati ports. Saudi imports were landing first in Dubai. Saudi businesses were building their regional headquarters in Abu Dhabi instead of Riyadh. The money, the decision-making, the gravitational pull of commerce, all of it was bending toward the Emirates, not toward the kingdom. Mohammed bin Salman came to power and made a simple, ruthless decision. That arrangement was going to end, and it was going to end in a way that left no doubt about who was in charge of the Arabian Peninsula's economic future. Vision 2030 is what the world sees. The tourism campaigns, the Formula One races, the concerts, the massive mega projects. But inside Vision 2030, buried beneath the entertainment and the investments, is a logistical master plan, so ambitious and so targeted that it reads less like an economic strategy and more like a declaration of war on Emirati commercial supremacy. Saudi Arabia committed more than $100 billion to transform itself into a global logistics hub, a sea and air hub that would make Jebel Ali look like a regional footnote. And the strategy was not just to build bigger. The strategy was to make doing business anywhere else actively painful. Let us start with what Saudi Arabia did with its ports, because the numbers here are staggering. In Jeddah, the South Container Terminal was upgraded in 2025. Its capacity did not grow modestly. It more than doubled, from 1.8 million TEUs to 4 million TEUs, with a clear path to 5 million. That is a single terminal expansion in a single year. Meanwhile, Saudi Arabia launched new shipping routes in partnership with Hapag-Lloyd and Maersk, two of the biggest shipping companies on earth, connecting Jeddah, Dammam, and Jubail to ports in Egypt, Morocco, Spain, Jordan, India, and Oman. And yes, technically also to Jebel Ali, though that connection will become interesting to revisit later. Then there is NEOM. Specifically, the piece of NEOM that nobody talks about enough, Oxagon. While the world was focused on the Line, that surreal straight-line city in the desert, Saudi Arabia was quietly building something arguably more strategically important. A fully automated container port on the Red Sea, positioned just after the mouth of the Suez Canal. Nal. Think about where that sits on a map. 12% of global trade passes through the Suez Canal. Every ship that exits the Suez Canal heading south into the Red Sea would pass directly by NEOM's new port before it reaches anywhere else. Scheduled to open with fully automated cargo handling, targeting up to 9 million TEUs in ultimate capacity. That is half of what Jebel Ali handles today. From a port that did not commercially exist 5 years ago, Saudi Arabia's national transport and logistics strategy set the goal of entering the global top 10 in logistics performance. It announced targets of 300 million air passengers and 4.5 million tons of air cargo annually. It launched the first rail-based freight bridge linking Jubail port to the Riyadh dry port, meaning cargo could now land at a Saudi port and move inland without ever touching Emirati soil. The total investment in port-related logistics zigging has reached $2.67 billion across 18 hubs. And to pull shipping volume directly away from Jebel Ali, Saudi Arabia offered something that shipping companies could not ignore: a 50% fee cut on transshipments at Saudi ports. The result was immediate. Within measurable time, 15% of Jebel Ali's previous transshipment volume had been lured away to Saudi facilities. But here is where it goes from competition to something that deserves the word sabotage. Saudi Arabia changed the rules of what counts as a Gulf product, eligible for duty-free trade within the GCC. Under the new interpretation, goods manufactured or processed in UAE free zones, including goods coming through Jebel Ali's massive Jafza free zone, which is the engine of UAE re-exports, were classified. They were no longer treated as originating inside the Gulf Cooperation Council. They were treated as foreign goods. And with that single policy shift, products flowing from Jebel Ali into Saudi Arabia began facing 12% import duties. 12%, where there had been 0 before. Analysts ran the numbers and estimated that by 2026, this reclassificat ion alone would cost traders using UAE free zones approximately $5 billion in new tariffs. $5 billion that would either come out of their profits, get passed to consumers, or, and this was the entire point, push them to find a route that did not go through the UAE at all. Then came the Regional Headquarters Program. Saudi Arabia announced that any multinational company that wanted access to Saudi government contracts, and in an economy where the state controls enormous purchasing power that is not optional, would need to establish its regional headquarters inside Saudi Arabia. Not in Dubai, not in Abu Dhabi, in Riyadh. The incentive was enormous: 0 corporate income tax, 0 withholding tax for an extended period. Companies that had spent years building their Middle East operations in Dubai faced a choice: stay in Dubai and lose access to Saudi contracts, or move to Riyadh and keep it. By October 2024, 540 companies had made the move. By October 2025, that number had jumped to 675. Tech giants like Google and Siemens had directed $50 billion worth of Saudi investments through their new Riyadh bases. $50 billion that, in a different world, would have been routed through UAE financial infrastructure. The aviation piece completes the picture. Saudi Arabia launched Riyadh Air, backed by $30 billion targeting 100 international destinations. That is a direct challenge to Emirates and Etihad, the two airlines that made the AUAE the gateway for business travel into and out of the region. For decades, if a European executive flew to the Middle East, they connected through Dubai or Abu Dhabi. Riyadh Air is designed to end that geographic advantage by making Riyadh itself the connection point. And when cargo follows passengers, as it always does, the logistics of the region shift with the flight paths. Now, everything described so far is aggressive. It is economically muscular. But it stays within the boundaries of legitimate economic competition. Tariffs, incentives, infrastructure investment, these are tools that nations use. They are legal, even if they are pointed like WEPONs. What happened next moves the story somewhere different. What happened next moves into Yemen, Sudan, and the Red Sea itself. And when you understand those pieces, you understand why this is not just a trade rivalry. It is a struggle over the physical geography of the new Silk Road. Yemen sits at the bottom of the Arabian Peninsula, where the Red Sea narrows into the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, one of the most strategically critical choke points in the world. Any ship moving between the Indian Ocean and the Suez Canal must pass through Bab el-Mandeb. It is the gate between east and west. And for years, the UAE had spent enormous resources building influence in Yemen, not just because of the civil war, but because whoever controls Yemen's southern ports controls the southern entrance to the Red Sea. The UAE-backed Southern Transitional Council, the STC, had become the dominant force in southern Yemen. Its presence in ports like Aden and Mukalla gave the Emirates a geographic foothold that no amount of port infrastructure investment at home could replicate. In late 2025, the STC launched a major military offensive in Yemen's Hadramaut and Mahra regions, territories that sit directly on the border between Yemen and Saudi Arabia. These were not random provinces. These were the oil-rich eastern lands, the border crossings, the overland supply corridors that Saudi Arabia considered essential to its own security and a regional strategy. Saudi Arabia had spent years carefully negotiating a ceasefire with the Houthis in the north. The STC's sudden offensive in the south threatened to blow that entire process apart, and not accidentally. Analysts at the Basha report were explicit. The STC's breakout was described as a deliberate effort to sabotage Houthi-Saudi peace talks. By seizing the south before any deal was sealed in the north, Emirati-backed forces would lock in their territorial gains, regardless of what Riyadh negotiated with Sana'a. Saudi Arabia responded with a ferocity that shocked observers. It called for a full UAE withdrawal from Yemen. It dissolved the STC as a legitimate political entity, and then it did something almost unprecedented in modern Gulf politics. It conducted airstrikes on what it described as Emirati weapons supply routes inside Yemen. Saudi Arabia, a nominal ally of the UAE for a decade, was bombing the logistics chains of Emirati-backed forces. That is not a trade dispute. That is something else entirely. The Red Sea theater did not stop at Yemen, moved north and west, across the water to Sudan, and the geography becomes even clearer. Sudan controls enormous stretches of Red Sea coastline. Saudi Arabia backs the Sudanese armed forces, the official government army. The UAE backs the Rapid Support Forces, the RSF, a paramilitary group that controls Sudan's informal gold trade, its inland route, as toward the Red Sea, and has built relationships with actors that Riyadh finds deeply uncomfortable, including Israeli-linked networks. The Saudi calculation is direct. If the UAE controls both Yemen's southern ports and Sudan's Red Sea access points, Riyadh's own coastline becomes squeezed between two zones of Emirati influence. The new Silk Road routes that Saudi Arabia needs for NEOM, for its logistics ambitions, for its post-oil economic future. All of them run through a Red Sea that could be strategically compromised. So Riyadh escalated. During Mohammed bin Salman's visit to Washington in November 2025, he reportedly urged the Trump administration to increase pressure on the UAE, specifically over its role in Sudan. In January 2026, Foreign Minister Faisal bin Farhan flew to Cairo and initiated something extraordinary, a joint Saudi-Egyptian effort to constrain Emirati logistical networks. Together, Riyadh and Cairo moved to restrict UAE cargo flights from using Egyptian and Saudi airspace, flights suspected of supplying the RSF in Sudan. They applied coordinated pressure on Libyan military commander K. Khalifa Haftar to disrupt smuggling routes that the UAE was using through Libya's Al-Kufra airport. A key Emirati logistical hub on its supply corridor into Sudan was temporarily closed. Saudi Arabia was not just competing with the UAE for trade routes, it was physically cutting Emirati supply lines across the entire region. The European Council on Foreign Relations, one of the most rigorous geopolitical research institutions in the world, put it plainly. The Saudi-Emirati Strategic Alliance, built on the already strained personal relationship between their leaders, had collapsed. The Gulf vision that had existed for a brief moment in September 2025, when Mohammed bin Zayed visited MBS after years of no contact, floating the idea of a unified Arab Gulf front, was destroyed in weeks by the Yemen offensive and the Sudan escalation. And yet, even with all of this happening, the official line from both capitals remained cordial. That is the part that makes this story so uniquely dangerous. This is not a war that is announced. There are no declarations, no sanctions, no diplomatic expulsions. There are tariff reclassifications and fee incentives and RHQ requirements and airspace restrictions and proxy forces in desert provinces. The weapons are shipping container fees and corporate tax rates and overnight airstrikes on supply convoys in countries that most people in the world could not find on a map. The battlefield is a 2,000-kilometer coastline that happens to be the hinge point of global trade between Asia and Europe. Here is the bigger picture. Because this story is not just about Saudi Arabia and the UAE, it is about what the new Silk Road actually is, and who actually controls it. China launched the Belt and Road Initiative more than a decade ago. It has poured hundreds of billions of dollars into infrastructure across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. It has invested in UAE ports. Both Khalifa and Jebel Ali have Chinese capital in them. It invested in Saudi petrochemical infrastructure. It built Oman's Duqm port. China understood something that most Western analysts were slow to recognize. The new geography of global power is not military. It is logistical. It is about who can move goods from where they are made to where they are consumed fastest, cheapest, and most reliably. And the Gulf, specifically the stretch of water from the Suez Canal down through the Red Sea and around into the Arabian Sea, is the most critical logistical corridor on Earth. Saudi Arabia and the UAE both understand this. That is why they are fighting. Not because they dislike each other personally, though the relationship between MBS and MBZ has clearly soured. They are fighting because the post-oil era is coming, and both nations have staked their entire economic survival on being the logistics hub that the new Silk Road runs through. There is only room for one winner at that level, or at least that is how both sides are behaving. And right now, Saudi Arabia, larger, richer in territory, sitting on both the Red Sea and the Arabian Gulf with a government willing to spend unlimited capital to reshape the rules, has all the momentum. The UAE is not standing still. DP World, the Emirati ports operator, is expanding into India, Pakistan, and East Africa, building a network of facilities that gives it logistics reach that purely domestic Saudi competitors cannot match. The UAE slashed corporate taxes to zero for qualifying free zone activities in 2025, fighting to retain businesses that the Saudi RHQ mandate was pulling away. It invested $50 billion in fleet expansion at Emirates and Etihad to defend its position as the region's premier aviation hub. In October 2025, there was Discus, scion of a CMA-CGM deal worth $450 million for a fourth terminal in Jeddah, which tells you something remarkable on its own. Even the major shipping companies are hedging, building relationships with both sides simultaneously, unwilling to bet exclusively on either Dubai or Riyadh. But there is a difference between defending a position and seizing one. The UAE is defending, Saudi Arabia is seizing, and in geopolitics, in economics, and in history, the difference between those two postures almost always determines the outcome. The International Crisis Group, the European Council on Foreign Relations, the Middle East Council on Global Affairs, all of these institutions are now tracking this rivalry as one of the defining dynamics of regional stability. Because when two of the wealthiest and most militarily capable nations in the Arab world are actively undermining each other's supply lines, it does not just affect their bilateral trade numbers. It affects Sudan's war. It affects Yemen's peace. It affects shipping insurance rates in the Red Sea. It affects whether smaller Gulf nations like Oman and Qatar, who have carefully maintained relationships to WTO, if both sides can continue to do so. It affects whether China's belt and road investments in the region begin to fracture along Saudi-Emirati fault lines. It affects whether the United States, which has strategic partnerships with both nations, finds itself forced to choose. The GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council, was built on the idea that the 6 Gulf monarchies shared enough common interest to coordinate their economies, their security, and their foreign policies. Saudi Arabia and the UAE were always the anchor of that arrangement, the two heavyweights whose alignment held everything else in place. That anchor is gone. And without it, the GCC's non-oil trade growth rate, which had been running at 15% annually since 2020, faces a slowdown towards single digits by 2027, according to analysts at ICAEW, as intra-GCC friction begins to replace intra-GCC cooperation. What does this mean for the new Silk Road itself? China built the BRI on the assumption that the Gulf would be a cooperative gateway, a smooth transit zone where goods flowing from Chinese factories could move through reliable infrastructure toward European and African markets. Instead, the Gulf's two most important logistics powers are now building competing networks, imposing competing tariffs, and fighting proxy wars over the ports and coastlines that the Silk Road runs through. CMA CGMs and Maersks of the world cannot optimize their routes when the rules change with the political temperature between Riyadh and Abu Dhabi. Every new tariff, every new airspace restriction, every STC offensive in a Yemeni province adds a new layer of cost and unpredictability to the most important shipping lane on the planet. There's a version of this story that ends with negotiation, where MBS and MBZ find a formula, where Saudi Arabia gets its logistics ambitions and the UAE retains its financial and re-export dominance, and the two countries divide the new Silk Road prize rather than destroying each other trying to win it alone. There are people in both capitals who want that outcome. The September 2025 meeting between the two leaders, before the Yemen offensive collapsed it, showed that a window for coordination existed. But there's another version of this story, the one that the on-the-ground evidence points toward more clearly right now, where this rivalry deepens, where Saudi Arabia's structural advantages in size, geography, and sovereign spending power gradually erode Dubai's position, where the UAE doubles down on its Israeli and Chinese partnerships as strategic multipliers against Saudi pressure, and to where the Red Sea becomes not a smooth highway of global commerce, but a contested theater where two visions of Middle Eastern economic dominance are played out through tariffs, terminal expansions, proxy armies, and airspace bans. The ships are still sailing. The containers are still moving. The global supply chain does not stop for geopolitics. It just gets more expensive, more unpredictable, and more opaque when geopolitics decides to embed itself inside the logistics. Right now, somewhere in the Red Sea, a container ship is making a routing decision based on fee structures that were set in Riyadh, transiting past coastlines where proxy forces are moving weapons on behalf of competing Gulf visions, heading toward a terminal that exists because a crown prince decided his country's future depended on it. That ship is not carrying just goods. It is carrying the evidence of a contest that will determine who controls the geography of the next century's trade. Saudi Arabia decided it was going to win that contest. The UAE decided it was not going to let them. And the new Silk Road, the great connective tissue of the modern global economy, runs directly through the space where those two decisions are colliding. And the world, for the most part, has absolutely no idea it is happening. But let us go back further. Because to understand what Saudi Arabia is doing right now, you need to understand the exact humiliation that preceded it. And humiliation is not too strong a word. For nearly 3 decades, Saudi Arabia, the largest economy in the Arab world, the custodian of Islam's holiest sites, the country sitting on the world's largest proven oil reserves, had to watch its smaller neighbor become the address that mattered. Dubai was not supposed to be this. Dubai was a fishing village. Abu Dhabi had the oil, not Dubai. And yet Dubai, through visionary port policy, through Jebel Ali's creation in 1979, through liberal trade rules and a free zone structure that welcomed foreign capital without conditions, became something entirely new. It became the node, the switching station through which the entire region's commerce flowed. And it is crucial to understand that much of that commerce was Saudi commerce. Saudi imports arriving first in Dubai, Saudi re-exports moving through Jebel Ali. Saudi businesses using Dubai as their regional hub because Dubai offered the infrastructure, the legal reliability, and the international connections that Riyadh simply could not match at the time. The number that captures this humiliation most precisely is this. Jebel Ali was handling 15.7 million TEUs in 2023, while Saudi Arabia's King Abdul Aziz port in Dammam, the kingdom's main Gulf Coast port, was handling just 2.3 million TEUs in the same year, 7 times less. Saudi Arabia, with a GDP more than double the UAE's, with a coastline stretching thousands of kilometers across both the Red Sea and the Arabian Gulf, was running a port the size of a secondary European terminal while its neighbor ran a global top 10 facility. That gap is not just an economic statistic. It is a statement about who had the vision, the execution, and the willingness to build. And for MBS, it was a statement that needed to be erased. Vision 2030 is often described in terms of tourism and entertainment, the concerts, the racing circuits, the ski slopes in the desert. But strip away the spectacle, and what Vision 2030 is really about, at its most fundamental level, is logistics. It is about Saudi Arabia becoming the node, replacing Dubai as the place where the Middle East's commerce decides to live. And the scale of investment required to do that is staggering even by sovereign wealth fund standards. More than $100 billion committed specifically to the transformation into a logistics hub. Not oil infrastructure, not defense, logistics, ports, airports, rail connections, free zones, digital trade platforms, industrial zones around terminal gates. The entire economic geography of the Arabian Peninsula was being deliberately redesigned, with Saudi Arabia at the center of the new map. The Jeddah Islamic port expansion tells that story in steel and concrete. This is the kingdom's largest Red Sea port, and it is being upgraded at a pace that the global shipping industry is watching closely. In 2025, French logistics giant CMA CGM was in discussions for a fourth terminal in Jeddah worth $450 million. A major international operator does not spend $450 million on a fourth terminal unless it believes the underlying volume is going to materialize. And Saudi Arabia was creating the conditions to make that volume materialize, not through natural growth, but through aggressive policy intervention. The 50% fee cuts for transshipment cargo were not a temporary promotion. They were a sustained structural intervention designed to permanently redirect shipping economics. When you make it 50% cheaper to call at Jeddah instead of Jebel Ali, you do not need to wait for shipping companies to develop a preference. You manufacture one. The rail piece is underappreciated and absolutely crucial. Saudi Arabia launched its first rail-based freight bridge linking Jubail port on the Arabian Gulf Coast to the Riyadh dry port, an inland container facility that serves the capital. What this creates is a land corridor, a domestic Silk Road within Saudi Arabia itself, connecting the Arabian Gulf Coast to the R. Head seacoast through Riyadh, meaning cargo can now arrive from Asia on the Gulf side, move by rail to Riyadh, and exit toward Africa and Europe through the Red Sea side, all without touching UAE territory, without going through Jebel Ali, without generating a single dirham of transit revenue for the Emirates. That is not an accident of urban planning. That is geography deployed as economic warfare. Saudi Arabia also announced plans to list Jeddah Islamic Port on the London Metal Exchange as a hub for copper and zinc, a direct attempt to pull commodity trading functions away from Dubai. Every financial instrument, every cargo contract, every insurance policy that migrates from Dubai to Riyadh is a piece of the UAE's economic identity transferred to its rival. And the companies are responding. The regional headquarters program created a pipeline that is moving faster than most analysts predicted. When Saudi Arabia announced that companies without an RHQ in Riyadh would lose access to government procurement, the corporate calculation was straightforward. Saudi Arabia's government spending on non-oil sectors has been running in the hundreds of billions. The Vision 2030 project list, NEOM, the Red Sea Project, Qiddiya, Roshan, the 100 other megaprojects, represents one of the largest concentrations of construction, engineering, technology, and services spending anywhere on Earth. Companies that want a piece of that spending cannot do it from Dubai anymore. So they moved. 675 companies had established a Riyadh regional headquarters by October 2025, up from 540 a year earlier. That is not a trickle. That is a structural shift in how multinational corporations are organized in the Middle East, happening in real time right now. The impact on UAE free zones is where the sabotage language becomes most justified. The Jebel Ali Free Zone, JAFZA, is one of the most successful economic zones ever created. More than 9,000 companies operate there. It is the infrastructure on which Dubai's entire re-export model rests. When Saudi Arabia reclassified goods processed in UAE free zones as faux RAIN rather than GCC origin goods, it was not a technical customs adjustment. It was a targeted strike at the economic model that Jebel Ali's value proposition depends on. The 12% tariff that now applies to JAFZA goods entering Saudi Arabia does not just add a cost. It forces companies to ask a fundamental question. If goods processed in Jebel Ali face a tariff penalty when they enter Saudi Arabia, why am I processing them in Jebel Ali at all? And the answer, increasingly, is maybe you shouldn't be. The estimated $5 billion in additional tariff costs by 2026 is a lower bound figure. It does not capture the behavioral shifts it triggers. Manufacturers and traders who quietly stop routing through UAE free zones to avoid the penalty. Those diverted flows represent a hollowing out of Jebel Ali's commercial rationale that is arguably more damaging than the tariff itself. You can absorb a tax. You cannot so easily rebuild a logistics network once the volume has moved and the shipping lines have adjusted their routes. The UAE is fighting back with everything it has. The 0% corporate tax for qualifying free zone activities was a direct response to Saudi Arabia's RHQ incentive program, an attempt to prevent the corporate exodus from Dubai by making the tax case for staying even stronger. DP World's aggressive international expansion into India, Pakistan, and East Africa is a conscious strategic hedge. If the UAE is going to lose influence over the routes that pass through Saudi territory, it will compensate by extending its reach into the origin and destination markets of those routes. 49-year concessions at ports in Mumbai, Dakar, Dar es Salaam, and a dozen other cities mean that DP World does not need Saudi permission to remain relevant in the trade flows between Asia and Africa. It is building a network that routes around Saudi Arabia rather than through it. But the physical geography is immovable, and the physical geography favors Saudi Arabia, a country with coastline on both the Red Sea and the Arabian Gulf, sitting at the exact center of the triangle between Asia, Africa, and Europe, can never be fully bypassed. It can be competed with. It can be undercut on fees. It can be maneuvered around at the margins. But the ships that carry the world's goods cannot change the map. Neom's port at the mouth of the Red Sea is not in its location by coincidence. 12% of global trade passes through the Suez Canal. Every single one of those ships must pass by Neom. Every single one of those ships is a potential customer. When Neom's automated terminal is fully operational, the question it will pose to every shipping line making a routing decision is simple. Why are you sailing past us to go to Dubai? And the answer, given fee structures, given turnaround times, given the Saudi market access behind the port, may increasingly be, we are not. China has been watching all of this with a particular intensity. Beijing's Belt and Road Initiative was designed on the assumption of a cooperative Gulf corridor. Chinese capital is embedded in both Jebel Ali and Khalifa Port in the UAE, and in Saudi petrochemical infrastructure in the Duqm Port in Oman. Beijing wants smooth, predictable passage for Chinese goods toward European and African consumers. A Saudi-Emirati rivalry that imposes new costs and geopolitical friction on the Red Sea corridor is a direct threat to BRI's operational assumptions. China has the leverage and the motive to push both sides toward accommodation, but whether that pressure is sufficient to moderate the rivalry is one of the most consequential unknowns of the current moment. The human cost is easy to miss in a story about container volumes and tariff codes. In Sudan, the Saudi-Emirati proxy competition over Red Sea access has fueled a civil war producing one of the world's worst humanitarian crises. The STC offensive in Yemen was preceded by years of southern Yemeni populations caught between competing Gulf visions of what their territory should be used for. The Horn of Africa, Somalia, Eritrea, Djibouti, Ethiopia, is experiencing a new layer of destabilization as Saudi and Emirati influence networks compete for the Red Sea's southern approaches. These are not abstract geopolitical consequences. They are lives, shaped by a competition over shipping fees and logistics market share that happens in boardrooms and palaces far from the people who suffer its effects. The New Silk Road was supposed to be a story of connection, of ancient trade routes reborn in modern steel and fiber optics and container ships, linking humanity's great centers of production and consumption in ways that generate prosperity at every node along the path. The Chinese vision was connectivity as diplomacy, the idea that nations bound together by shared infrastructure would find more reasons to cooperate than tida or conflict. In the Gulf, that vision is colliding with a different reality. Two nations that share an interest in being the central node of the new Silk Road, but whose interests are mutually exclusive. Only one of them can be the hinge. Only one of them can be the place where global commerce decides to root. And both of them have decided that achieving that position is worth almost any cost. The ships are still sailing, the containers are still moving, but the route they take, the fees they pay, the ports they call at, the countries they enrich, all of that is being quietly rewritten, one policy change and one proxy conflict at a time, by two neighbors who understand better than anyone else on Earth that in the 21st century, the most powerful thing a nation can control is not a weapon. It is a route,